I'm Evan Douglas, the Dean of the School of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, the distinguished architect, educator, scholar, historian, Institute Professor Emeritus, and former Dean of the School of Architecture, Professor Patrick J. Quinn. Passionately committed to the acquisition and dissemination of knowledge throughout his life as a creative, benevolent gift for our world community, Quinn's life's work exemplifies the definition of a true Renaissance man. Incessantly curious about the philosophical and conceptual underpinnings found throughout the history of religious architecture, the mystical qualities attributed to great buildings, and the larger purpose of education as an essential and universal form of cultural production, Quinn has led an extraordinary life of creative exploration as evidenced in his highly acclaimed writings, pedagogy, buildings, service to the profession, and more recently, his celebrated efforts as a gifted stage actor. Albert Einstein once said, and I'm quoting, "Never regard study as a duty, but as an enviable opportunity to learn, to know the liberating influence of beauty in the realm of the spirit for your own personal joy and to the profit of the community to which your later works belong." Quinn's evolving and impressive legacy as a leader in our profession has left an indelible mark on the advancement of architectural education, our appreciation of the history and creation of religious buildings, and maybe, most importantly, the lives of a widespread community of fellow colleagues and former students around the world who have been forever changed by his profound wisdom, generosity, and goodwill. An overview of his bio: born and educated in Dublin, Ireland, he practiced architecture with RIBA gold medal winner Michael Scott before moving to the USA. After graduate studies under Lou Kahn at the University of Pennsylvania, he has combined practice, teaching, and research for most of his professional life. A professor for 12 years at Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, he also practiced in San Francisco, where his firm won national and international awards for religious architecture. As Dean of Architecture and Institute Professor at RPI, he established the Roman Studies program in 1981, as well as had commissioned works in Florida, New York, France, India, Italy, and Troy, New York. His writings and works have been published internationally in 7 languages, and he has lectured at over 50 universities on 4 continents. His designs and drawings have been exhibited in London, Paris, Rome, Dublin, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. He has chaired AIA Design Award juries in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. Quinn is an active member of the Society of Architectural Historians and the Forum for Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality. In addition to being named the Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, he's also a Fellow of the Royal Society for Arts, the American Academy in Rome, and the Society for Arts, Religion, and Contemporary Culture. He's also a former AIA chapter president and was president of ACSA. In retirement, if that term even applies to Professor Quinn's prolific, ever-evolving career, he has also found in his later years a keen interest in theater. He is a professional coach for Irish accents and has been cast in numerous shows with local companies. Most recently, he was part of Confetti Stage's Festival of Short New Plays. After acting in several roles, he was awarded the 2018 New York State Theater Institute Award for excellence in acting. Beyond his impressive scholarly and cultural pursuits, he's also a competitive and internationally ranked swimmer. He holds top 10 world records in the 1500 millimeter, freestyle, and 200 millimeter breaststroke in the age group 75, 80, and 85. It is a true honor, and I mean that on behalf of the school, to invite Patrick Quinn back to Rensselaer School of Architecture. Patrick.
The big question is, can anybody speak after that?
Well, you certainly deserve it, and I'm only telling the truth.
I once had to introduce Aldo van Eyck, the great Dutch architect at Berkeley, and he was selecting his slides behind a screen and said, take a little long time at the introduction. So I gave him a very long introduction. And when I finished and said, Professor Aldo van Eyck, he said, no, not yet. I haven't finished selecting my slides. So I had to talk some more. Thank God I've got my slides ready. Anyway, thank you, Evan. That was too much. Before I begin, I would like to say something to the students, most of whom were not born before I even retired. That's how long it is since I've been lecturing at RPI. And since you're all very advanced in digital technology, you must recognize that I'm a kind of a dinosaur in that realm. And I've relied on the good offices of Robert Wolseley, who's brilliant, to help me prepare this lecture, and my daughter, Siobhan, who's a PhD student. Before I get into the slides proper, I want to put before the students that I have not a very complex philosophy of design or anything else. I have two principles. One, that a building should stand up and keep the water out. Two, that architecture, not just building, but architecture should bring joy. This is an RPI student. Elise Johnson was an RPI student. Great diver on the RPI diving team, drawing in the marvelous Jain Temple of Ramekpur. The first building you saw was the chapel at Fort Ross, California, after the 1906 earthquake. You noticed that the roof and the cupola remained intact. I one day took Denise Scott Brown and the great Aldo van Eyck to see this part of Fort Ross, California, which was really responsible for the establishment of the government's Monroe Doctrine, which says no foreign power can have a settlement on our land. Anyway, we went inside. I don't have the original slides, so I have sketches to show you. And we noticed that the cupola, this tiny cupola on top, opened to a great circular void over the sanctuary, as it were.
Hey, Patrick, your microphone is off for some reason. You have to turn your mic back on.
Are we all right there?
Yeah, you'll have to restate what you just said. That's okay.
Okay. The cupola, which penetrates the roof, illuminated by two windows, one east and one west, opens with a curve, a double curve, to eventually cast a light that covers most of the congregation, most of the people and priests. Aldo van Eyck and I were curious about this and how it managed to stand during an earthquake. And I said, I've got a solution. It was built by a cooper. You know what a cooper is? One who makes barrels. I said, what do you mean? And I explained what a cooper does. Here is a shot of Guinness's cooperage around 1920. It shows a barrel almost made, and you will notice that the staves not only curl out and in, but the edges of them are curved from top to bottom, out and in. And secondly, they're cut on the inside, so that there are 4 kinds of curvature, and the barrel is put together, and the bottom staves, which you can see here, are brought in under steam. And this man with the chime hoop hammers the hoops into place. The gentleman on the right, whom you can't see, I'm afraid, because, can you see the part of the right there? Can you see the right-hand side of the screen? Good. He has what is called a brace and bit, a primitive drill that you wind like this. This man is using a spoke shave to trim the staves. These are all master coopers, except one who was apprenticed, and he was my father. He came from 4 generations of coopers going back to the 1820s and before. And now we shift to another contrast. Nobody would have thought there was a connection between Guinness's cooperage and the chapel at Fort Ross. This was a picture that depicted the monastery of Simonopatra on Mount Athos. Mount Athos is a wild mountain in northern Greece where 20 monasteries are isolated from the world. Monks came in the 9th century to settle this place. They were fleeing from the desert. They were desert fathers fleeing from Egypt, looking for the wilderness, the pure desert, away from society. When I first saw this picture, a photograph, in my father's book of knowledge, I fell in love with it. I was probably 7 years of age, and I thought, this is my magic castle. This is the enchanted place I can find one day in the world. I've got to go there. I was 7 years of age. Those monks settled there in the 9th century, and they are still all over that mountain today. But earlier, in the 6th century, or perhaps the latter half of the 5th century, some earlier Greek monks, or Orthodox monks, desert fathers from Egypt, took sail out through the Mediterranean, out into the wild Atlantic, and sailed north until they found a 600-foot high rock sticking out of the wild Atlantic, and it's called Skellig off the coast of Kerry in Ireland. They climbed that rock and built dry stone beehive cells and a chapel and so on. We're looking down over the cells from the ocean. It's a tough climb up to get here in the sketch. They are 2 introductory connections between the unlikely. Now I want you just to think back a moment with me. These 2 sets here bookend my 5 years in the School of Architecture in University College Dublin. The first project we were given was to draw the classic Roman alphabet as seen on the column of Trajan. To draw the capitals of the Roman alphabet and to render them as if they were incised in stone, which meant shadowing them and drawing them very carefully and so on. Shadow them in watercolor. The second project in that first year was an angler's rest house. And when I first walked on the Grand Canyon, on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, I came across the Traveler's Rest House, still a 1-room thing, designed by, I think her name was Catherine Coleman, an architect, or Portland, an architect not mentioned in the history of architecture, but did a beautiful thing, which connects me with my first year design. At the end of 5 years, we had to produce a thesis. Mine was an Olympic stadium, which ends up being 60 inches by 40 inches by 60 inches in 2 sections. That gives you an idea of the kind of thing. First couple of years were classical. The last 3 years were modern. That's the way it went. Now, what has this got to do with me? My name is on it. A grandson of mine who lives in Paris, who is a descendant of the great Leopold Senghor, founder of Senegal. Oh, I've lost my slides. What's happened? Sharing windows closed.
You just have to go get them, Patrick.
Okay.
Yeah. Little timeout to everyone.
Oh, dear, dear. Are we there? Are they coming?
Not yet.
Oh, hell.
Okay. Take your time.
Click on one.
Hey, Robert?
Yeah.
Robert Woolsey?
We're back.
There you go.
You got it.
Oh, no, we haven't got it. We got to get rid of this, Siobhan. How do I get rid of that?
You want to make full screen one of the slides, right? That book cover will be your full screen, Patrick.
Green. Oh, there we are. No, it doesn't work. Hell's bells. How do I get rid of that?
Yeah,
Oh, hell.
go up to start the slideshow, and I think you can start it from the current slide.
Right
There you go. Now you can do play from current slide at the top there.
Open that up again, Patrick. Go back to slideshow and hit that.
Yeah.
And go to the second to the left. Yeah.
There you go.
Got it.
All right.
Oh dear, you see what a dinosaur I am in digital technology. In any case, my grandson in Paris found this on the web in the Dublin Print Museum. I didn't know I had anything at the Dublin Print Museum, but I helped to put myself through college by designing commercially book jackets, book covers, posters, medals, all sorts of things. This was for an international students' games. We go back still further. When I was 2, as depicted here by my father, I wandered into his Brussels sprouts patch. Now, Brussels sprouts are quite tall, about 2'6" or 3 feet tall. So a little boy in diapers can wander in there, and one is in a green forest whose canopy allows the sun to reflect in different ways on the surfaces and to dapple the ground, the sandy soil, and make it warm under one's feet. I remember this feeling, even though I was only 2. I was in heaven. I'd never been in a place like this. It was comforting, it was sheltering, it was delightful. Later, when I was 6, oh, by the way, I should say the next time I had a feeling like that, I was standing in the great redwoods, the sequoias of Muir Woods in California, where the sunlight dappled the ground again, and scarlet or yellow poppies, the golden poppies of California, dotted the surface. Bay trees gave a beautiful smell. It was a total experience, except that by the redwood trees this time, I was dwarfed, I was tiny. So it was like Gulliver going from Lilliput to Brobdingnag, or vice versa. When I was 6, my father took me to Newgrange, which you see here in the 30s and 40s, before it became commodified for tourists by designation as a World Historic Site. There's a slot above the entrance here, which brings the light in directly on the winter equinox and touches the far end of this passage grave, which is over which is built this great mound of soil. This is one of the few oldest buildings in the world, 1,000 years older than the pyramid. The closest to it are the Gigantia of the island of Malta. Some of you have been there. So my father borrowed the key from a local farmer who came in with us into this long passage. And at the end, the equinox sun illuminated one of the burial chambers, which I thought I saw contained tiny bones. I knew it was a buried chamber. I got scared stiff. I ran out crying and sat on this stone and traced with my finger the carved coils resembling a Greek Ionic volute, or a ram's horn, or so many beautiful spiral things in nature which gave rise to Renaissance mathematicians' love of the Fibonacci series and the Fibonacci spiral. So the connection goes back and forth through centuries. The result of that was I became enamored of caves. Some boys at the football field of our school, which was a mile from the school and was surrounded by new construction beginning, they said, "Do you want to see our pirate's cave?" And I said, "Yes." And they took me down through a 20-inch drainage pipe that stuck out of the ground and went at 30 degrees deep under the soil. They brought candles and matches, and we found ourselves in a cavern, a great cavern, 10 feet high, vaulted, and sandy bottom with an opening at the end. Not this one, this is not the thing. It is a completely enclosed cave in which we sat and were pirates, and we talked pirate caves. We were 15 or 16. We were pirates. I saw an opening at the end, and I said, "Where does that go?" And one of the boys said, "Well, let's see." We went down through a 40-foot-long corridor and turned left. These are all stone-built or brick-built, and came to a blank wall. He said, "Okay, that's as far as it goes. Let's go back." I said, "Just a minute." I put my ear to the wall and felt the sound of thundering water rushing by. I said, "Oh my God, let's get out of here." I didn't use that expression when I was 15. We got out of there. It took me 60 years to discover what this thing was. And I found recently, looking at ancient maps of Dublin, this was probably one of the many underground rivers of Dublin, in this case, the Poddle River. And on an ancient map, it showed that the Poddle River served a mill called the Rutland Mill, long since disappeared. So we were presumably in the bowels of the mills that had long been covered up by soil and by development. So ever since, I've been in love with caves. I had read The Coral Island by R.M. Ballantyne. I'd read Treasure Island, all of these wonderful things. And so it's not surprising that when I visited places like Cotignac in France, I would climb up the cliff and visit grottos like this. I found north of Rome in Castel Sant'Elia, above a gorge, a great gorge, sits a Franciscan church. And there's a pathway leading down to a cliffside pathway. And off that are caves, which were once occupied by monks. A plan here shows the pathway and a trellis outside it, and one of the caves which I deemed to be the chapel, and drew a reconstruction of this for a publication in Belgium that needed it. How do you doodle? Every architect doodles, and I find in my papers dozens and dozens of doodles, but I found this the other day, and it's particularly telling. It shows connections between aspects of my life. These are caves, of course, probably that monastery again in Castel Sant'Elia on the cliff. This is probably my magic castle, childhood images of fairyland, it back to Mount Athos. These, of course, are images of my aspirations as a young athlete. I love to dive off an 18-foot bridge into 6 or 7 feet of water and just skim the sandy bottom. It's not surprising that then when I did this church in Boca Raton, Florida, the ambulatory has a cave-like character, a vaulted ceiling and recesses and so on. Not as dark as this normally, but this ambulatory wanders around the church, around the center of the church, around the sanctuary, and gives one pause before entering the Holy of Holies and so on. back to another connection. It says here in 1958, I won a national design competition in Ireland for an oratory on Croagh Patrick. Croagh Patrick is a mountain, a wild mountain on the northwest of Ireland, where St. Patrick is supposed to have fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the 5th century. The competition was to design an oratory so that the pilgrims who come up to pray on the top of that mountain, and it's probably about 2,500 feet high, not big by American standards, but by Irish standards, and to build a small oratory there. This one I designed with local stone dug out of the mountain and shaped the walls to divert the Atlantic gales. The little oratory, beginning with the shrine of St. Patrick here, opens up to allow the pilgrims to gather in shelter from wind and rain, which always come from the west, and did the same for a little plaza patio around which there are walls protecting the toilets, coffee shop, and so on. Why do I show this? It's only about 100 miles north. If we took if a fly flew from here 100 miles south, I have to move this, south along the Atlantic, he would come across Skellig Hill, where the 6th century monks established their island retreat. St. Patrick probably never knew them, never came near them. Maybe he did, but here we are. Patrick was on this rock. The Greek monks from the Egyptian desert, actually, the Orthodox monks. And St. Patrick, of course, was a Roman, son of a Roman centurion. And here are the Greeks and the Romans connecting, but not knowing it, in the west of Ireland in the 5th century. Now, why do I introduce this? This is Louis I. Kahn, or Lou Kahn, as we call him. I believe this face here is the face, I think it's the face of Michael Walkholder, a student at Berkeley, who really is the inventor, founder, and former manager of RPI's Tech Park. He was a landscape student of mine in Berkeley, who came here to New York and was hired by George Lowe to start the Tech Park. Why Lou Kahn? Well, when I had worked for 5 years in Ireland and ended up winning that competition, I had decided that I wanted to unlearn everything I'd learned in undergraduate school. That's a tall order. I got fed up with brick and stone, and I grew up in a Georgian city and classical, beautiful buildings all around, but America was the place where they were experimenting with architecture. That was the future. So I applied for fellowships, and my Maureen and I got married and took the last voyage of the Ile de France to America, to New York. And in the summer, I worked in an office in Connecticut, just close to the great Stratford Shakespeare Playhouse there, which was very handy. I confessed to a colleague in the office, a great sculptor called Gil Schweitzer, who taught at Yale in the School of Architecture, that I was very disappointed. Yale had screwed up my fellowship application and left it too late to admit me or to give me anything. Cornell had lost its dean. They screwed up too. This all happened the same year in 1958. But my third choice, Penn, had offered me a fellowship, and I had to go there. Gil Schweitzer turned to me and said, "You are one of the luckiest men around." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Take this home and read it." He gave me a copy of Architectural Forum, which had the Trenton Bathhouse project by Lou Kahn. I looked at this and I said, "Oh, who is this guy?" The reason Schweitzer told me to read this was when he said, "You're going to Penn? Lou Kahn is leaving Yale and he's going to start a new graduate studio at Penn. You're going to meet Lou Kahn." And I looked up and I said, "Who's Lou Kahn?" His jaw dropped a mile. He couldn't conceive of a young architect who'd never heard of Lou Kahn. Well, most of us in Europe had never heard of Lou Kahn at the time. So I arrived at Penn And 12 of us were in this new graduate studio. We all had at least 4 or 5 years of practice. We were all cool, sophisticated young architects. You know, we knew it all. We talked about Vivaldi and Mies and Le Corbusier and all that, the usual stuff. And while we waited for the professor, the janitor came in his dusty old suit and scraggly hair and dandruff on his collar and started wiping the chalkboard off. And when he had wiped most of the stuff off the board, he stopped and he drew 2 semicircles, one large and one big, on top of a horizontal line. And he said, a space shows how it's made. That got our attention. We said, that's a curious thing for a janitor to have to say. And then he turned around, smiled, continued talking. It was Lou Kahn. 20 minutes later, he stopped talking. I looked at my watch. He'd been speaking for 2.5 hours. Spellbinding. Spent a year with Lou. Fell absolutely in love with him. He wasn't talking about pre-stressed or post-tensioned or membrane concrete, which I was hoping to study. He was talking about his concept of what generates architecture. He would say, order is. Design is form-making in order. He was talking about order, the order of axe, the order of spoon, being the essential existence will of a tool, a barrel, didn't matter, a building. And this was his quest. He talked about his Rochester church design, which was on paper then. He talked about a building he was doing in Fargo, North Dakota, as a violin in a violin case. Those of you who know the Troy Music Hall will recognize that image. It's a violin in a violin case. The ambulatory is the violin case. I thought that Lou, during those, during that first year, he evoked in me memories of my favorite poem of William Butler Yeats. Sorry, I keep touching this thing. The Song of Wandering Aengus. And those of you who know this poem know how beautiful it is. And Lou was really the guy who went to blow the fire aflame and who ended up seeking the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. During his studio, he talked about Beethoven and the Temple of Poseidon at Paestum in the same voice. I did this cartoon drawing at Paestum, where he told me I must go to visit. I didn't go until many years later. I drew this as the Temple at Paestum responding to Beethoven. Beethoven's 7th in my mind. As I was drawing it, this is some years after I'd left his studio, I was drawing very carefully, and as I was walking down this passage between the colonnade, the exterior colonnade, and the cella, I thought of Lou's statement, one of the first statements he made in studio: consider the moment when the walls parted and the column became, or the wall parted and the column became. And I thought of it, can't go back. I thought of it as I walked down here, and I remembered, what the heck is happening here? Sorry. I remembered Vincent Scully talking about how Lou and he had felt that there was a beautiful transition between this temple and the next one in the far distance, the Temple of Chereas. This is Hera 2, or the Temple of Poseidon, because they're all, it's made from the sea, of limestone deposits on the foot of the sea millions of years ago, carved, travertine in other words, carved into these columns, where I emphasize the entasis. But as I walked along and drew, this is where I learned that in order to see, you abandon a camera and you draw. Why? Because I saw along the base of this peristyle raised plates, just a small indication of raised sections of the travertine pavement, probably about the thickness of this pen, about a centimeter, the thickness of that pen. And I started thinking about this. And the more I looked, the more I felt as I stood between the columns, there was a kind of a porch there, an enclosure. The volume of the column base was approximately the same as the volume of the space between the columns. And when it went above a certain height and tapered, the sense of place and enclosure was lost. I called it the Porches of Paestum. And when I came back to the American Academy a couple of weeks later, I was asked to talk about my research to the assembled fellows and some visiting bigwigs like Robert Stern and Stanley Tigerman, the postmodernists, the heroes of postmodernism, good friends. And they loved this idea. They thought it's a bit far out. It's as far out as my idea of a Russian Cooper doing the cupola in Fort Ross. But here I was thinking that this architect in the 5th century BC had discovered the idea of implied space, not defined space, but implied space, which many of us use today. A scholar, a rather stuffy scholar from either Harvard or Princeton, was in the back row of the auditorium, the lecture room, and said, "Why aren't they in the cella?" He meant, why aren't they in here? And I said, I don't know. You know, I wasn't a classical scholar, I'm an architect, drawing. And he said, oh, you'll find them in various temples. Agena, for instance. I'd never heard of Agena. So I said, oh, interesting. I'll go and visit it. So I visited a lot of temples, Doric temples. Now the Parthenon columns certainly have no sense of porch. And I got to the island of Agena. I drew many sketches of these buildings, not just the facades. But the facades I show here, how far apart these columns are. And there was no evidence of raised plates anywhere. So I had discovered, I think, a unique 5th century BC architect or engineer, or whatever they called them in those prehistoric days. In Luke Kahn's studio, I designed a parish church, which used as its inspiration soap film. Soap film, according to my great teacher, Robert Loricole, who had studied such things and studied marine biological structures, radiolaria, that sort of thing in the ocean, told me that soap film was the most efficient structure ever found in nature or anywhere in existence. That it was with minimal surface and minimum material, it spanned the most. We did a lot of experiments with soap film in wire cubes and so on. He gave me the idea when I said I wanted to develop conic sections to make this church. Conic sections are cut from a circular cone vertically, diagonally, horizontally, and so on. And you get ellipse, you get hyperbola, you get parabola. This church is elliptical in plan, is parabolic in cross section, and it's hyperbolic in long section. It's like a hyperbolic paraboloid, which were all the rage at that time. I used it later. Oh, my internet connection's unstable, I said. I used it later as inspiration for a design for an entry in the Liverpool Cathedral competition, an international competition, which had something like 500 or 600 entries from all over the world. My entry got an honorable mention, one of 2 from America that year that managed to get awards. John Jacob was the other one from the University of Arizona. And I thought I was going to win the thing, and I was disappointed when I didn't win it, according to a colleague of mine who said I was very disappointed. But I found years later that Peter Eisenman, great friend, one of the founders of postmodernism in this country, had entered it too and had not got a mention. So I felt very happy about that. Lou had ended his work some years later by completing the government center in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which I went to see long after he died. Extraordinary building. And when I came home after seeing that, we made a special trip to Bangladesh. When I came home after seeing it, I made these sketches from memory. They showed the lagoon around which are gathered, well, there's a plaza where we visited on the feast, the Muslim feast of Eid, where all traffic and all business stopped, and all the people came out and visited Lou's government center. There's a bridge from this plaza, if you come up these steps, a bridge across the road leads to the entrance to the government center and the mosque. Oops, back, sorry. I wrote under this, Impressions of Dhaka in memory of Lou Kahn. Piranesi only dreamed of such spaces. Le Corbusier could never match this nobility. Kahn had written to me in 1961, 2 years after I left his studio, when he knew I had done well in the cathedral competition. He said, a cathedral should be the last thing a man does before he closes his book. This was Lou's cathedral. I said this was his cathedral, and he died on the way home on his last trip there. He died on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1974. And on that day, Baruch Gavoni, the great climatologist, building climatologist from the Technion, and I were sitting in our house in Troy, in my house in Troy, talking about the trouble in Israel and the trouble in Northern Ireland. And he said, stop, let's talk about something inspiring like Lou Kahn. Lou was dying that day in Grand Central Station in New York. His body lay for 3 days unidentified in the morgue because he didn't have any identification on him for some reason. I wrote at the end of this thing, this place, which we happened to walk through when it was closed because we had discovered a student whose father could get us admitted when it was empty. And when we walked through this place with no other people around, this is supposed to be us walking around, myself and the student in mourning and his wife. And I said I wrote here, this place could resound with Beethoven, whose music Lou loved so much. Every major architect somehow builds his cathedral. This is Frank Gehry's cathedral. He never designed a Catholic or Christian cathedral, never designed a mosque like Lou did. But this is his Bilbao Guggenheim Museum. Now they won't let you, I spent a week there just to see it. I wanted to figure out what Gehry was about. They wouldn't let me photograph inside. So I had to draw. Tough thing to draw, but wild and wonderful. And while I came to the conclusion, this is Gehry's cathedral, as the Industrial Museum outside Glasgow by Zaha Hadid is her cathedral. 3 musicians, young guys, they came in while I was drawing. And they started the greatest rock music you ever heard. And I said, Gehry would love this. Rock music, it is rock music, it is rocker cathedral. We switched to an utter contrast, and yet related. This is a chapel which one of my heroes, Thomas Merton, the Cistercian monk, with whom I corresponded many years ago. He called this the most beautiful monastic chapel in America. I agree. It's designed by a man who was interned by the US government in a prisoner of war camp in Oregon in 1942, after Pearl Harbor. His name was Japanese, George Nakashima. He was born and grew up in Seattle. He was an American citizen. He was there for a year, but he had worked abroad. He had got his master's degree from MIT and sold his car and took a tramp steamer around the world looking at architecture. He worked in Tokyo with a great American architect, Antonin Raymond, on Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel, which withstood the great Tokyo earthquake. He moved from there. Antonin Raymond took him to Pondicherry in India, where he worked and is renowned for his work on an ashram, a dormitory in an ashram in Pondicherry, just outside Pondicherry. When I first visited this church, I could see something in that architect that spoke of far more than an ordinary guy. It was a cave, and you know how I love caves, with caves off it. High windows opening up to the 600-foot high cliff behind, topped by pines. The altar is a simple stone block with a slab on top. The lectern is made from driftwood from the river that flows through the canyon, the desert canyon, in which George designed this Church of Christ in the Desert for two monks who had left Rochester, New York, and settled in tents in that valley. Somehow they found George, and he designed this building with the small, wonderful wooden benches, dirt floor, and so on. Why would anybody put a jet restrainer parachute in a church? Well, to create a space as intimate as the one that George Nakashima had created at Christ in the Desert. One of my associates, partners, Tom Brown and I, were asked by a Benedictine monk who was the pastor of a church, a very underused, large, old Gothic church in the south side of Chicago, in what was called the Cabrini housing project, a tough, difficult area of South Chicago at the time. The police even found it dangerous to enter the apartments. We were asked to reorder this church to correspond to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which meant making the assembly for the liturgy more intimate. So we removed the front 10 rows of pews, and the locals, the community, it's an African-American community, or was then, built this table, which we placed outside the existing altar rails and a baptistry off to the right. And they said, we need a baldacchino. This place is too big. It's not intimate enough. And my partner, Tom Brown, who was responsible, he sponsored me coming to America, another Irishman. And he said, have you ever thought of a jet restrainer parachute? I said, no. He said, I'll get one. He went to a used army surplus store and bought this parachute, which we tied up to the column tops. And it made a beautiful space. Decades later, the Cabrini housing project was knocked down and the place started to be gentrified. The population changed. And I went back to visit this church, and to my surprise, the parachute was gone, the table was gone, a dingy sort of new precious altar was built, and a baldacchino, a pathetic little baldacchino was built of the kind that you find in Las Vegas wedding chapels. Sometime after Lou had written to me that about the cathedral, 4 of us young professors at Berkeley met with J.B. Jackson, the editor of Landscape magazine, a wonderful magazine whose archived copies in the library you students should read. Seriously, great magazine, no longer produced. Rick Jackson listened to the four of us argue in Charles Moore's radical new house in Orinda, California. And he said, why don't you guys write a manifesto? You ought to. You've got the material. So we said, well, we'll think about it. So we thought about it and talked about it for about a month. And at the end up, we came up with an article in his magazine called Toward Making Places. The authors were Don Linden, who later became, we were all assistant professors except for Charles. Don became head of architecture at MIT. Charles became dean at Yale. Sima Vanderin became state architect. And you know what happened to Patrick Quinn. He ended up at RPI. Toward Making Places was our manifesto. It went over like a lead balloon. Nothing. No response. Deadly. We were not trailblazers. But 10 years later, every major school in the world was talking about architecture as making places. And even today, you still hear about placemaking. So we felt pretty good then. But at the time, it had a vague familiarity to me. And years later, I remembered a small volume written in 1898 by a young Irish poet, Alice Meynell, my father's favorite poet from Wexford. Alice Meynell, remember the Meynell, who wrote a small book called The Spirit of Place. 100 years before most Americans even thought about it, she had written this little book. I have it on my shelf. My first attempt to put into practice our idea of making places was to make this small church complex for a poor community in Marina, California, across from Fort Ord, the Army station. It consisted of a chapel, a hall, which could be connected, a school, which could be connected, and a rectory, all accessed from a common place. The idea, and all oriented to control the Southern California sun, the hot rays, entered through a kind of cave-like entrance to a place that opened up to light. It was supposed to symbolize and create a place of hospitality, openness, transparency, and degrees of inwardness. These are elements that came out in discussions between my then partner and I, Dennis Shanaher. We were Shanaher Quinn Associates. One day, I should explain that it could be built in 4 phases. They didn't have much money. So you start with the chapel, and the hall, and the school, and the rectory. You've got the whole. This is what it ended up looking like. A young monk came by the office while we were designing this and said he'd been sent by an editor in New York who had published my Liverpool Cathedral thing and my Pope Patrick thing in a magazine called Liturgical Arts. Maurice Laveno, a great editor, great scholar, had sent this young monk from Belgium to see me because the young monk was on his way to talk to some fellow Benedictines in Vallejo, California, for whom Kahn was designing a new monastery. And he wanted also to talk to Sister Corita Kent, the one who did some great silkscreen design studies. He looked at our little scheme then in sketch form and said, may I publish it? And I said, why? Why? You know, it hadn't even been built yet. And we thought, this is a bit much. My partner, as I said why, my partner cringed. He thought, yes, 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 publish it. We want publication. De Buist was the young man's name, the young monk's name, Frederick de Buist. He was editor of a journal called Art d'Église, the art of the church, in Belgium, which really was a kind of focal, a source of the best thinking about liturgical architecture and religious architecture in Europe at that time. That, along with an Italian journal, were the two leading inspirational journals of the time in the field in which I was interested in. And we said, may I publish it? And I said, why? And he said, because the German hierarchy is pressing me to publish Kenzo Tank's design for Tokyo Cathedral, and I don't want to do it because it's monumental, it's arrogant, it's inappropriate. I said, my God, Tange was one of my heroes. He had designed the Olympic Stadium, for heaven's sakes, for the Tokyo Olympics. I loved the guy. He had come to Berkeley to speak, and here was my little humble thing going to take its place. Well, of course, I went years later to see Tongas Cathedral in Tokyo and thought it was beautiful. But in any case, we got that published, and it came out in a journal, along with Lou Kahn's initial design for Valyermo and Sister Corita Kent's serigraphs. So I was very happy to be beside my Lord and Master, Lou Kahn. Well, never my Lord and Master. 15 years later, I got a chance to do another center in Boca Raton, Florida. I've done several things in between. This time with another associate, an Italian architect in South Florida, a wonderful guy. And again, we had a church, school, rectory, and hall to come here. The church had a double roof to combat the heat in Florida. It also helped with drainage, installation, all the rest. And all the windows in it faced north, except those on the south side of the ambulatory, which I showed you some time ago, which was sheltered by a walkway, a colonnaded walkway past a fountain before one entered in. There were degrees of inwardness. The school consisted of each classroom being a little house. We're looking at the south side of the church here now, and we're looking at the school. And in the school, we had a high light, a high window, which illuminated the whole space. So the teacher wouldn't have to come in every morning and switch on the light and waste electricity. The lower windows had a very low sill. So that the young kids, this is elementary school, second grade and so on, so that if they got bored by a boring teacher, they could look out at the firemen in the firehouse across the way and watch the engines going back and forth, and much more interesting stuff. Now, I started to show you at the beginning a slide of Fort Ross after the 1906 earthquake. In October the 18th, well, 3 days from now is its anniversary, 1989, the Bay Area and south of it suffered an incredibly dangerous and damaging earthquake. The highway was broken down, the Bay Bridge collapsed, and this issue of the San Francisco Chronicle was sent to me by Mary Rice, for whom, with her husband, I had designed a very beautiful house in California on a hillside that withstood the earthquake. And she said, see page 5. Page 5 showed that the earthquake epicenter was 15 miles from a church I had designed in wood. All of my buildings out there were wood, not concrete or post-tension or anything like that. They're wood, simple wooden structures. Had withstood the earthquake, and it was being used as a shelter for the people whose homes had been damaged. So she said, your building stands up and keeps the water out. These are light studies, one of which I'll show you. This is how we used to look at the lights for our different churches, how the light could be focused or distributed. I learned some of this in Rome, actually, when I looked first at a Baroque church. Tall, narrow space, whose walls were covered with ornament with golden tips. And the setting sun, when all the candles and lights were off and the place was unoccupied, just touched some of those golden tips and turned it into a beautifully reflective and wonderfully mysterious place. They reminded me of a book by Tanizaki. Some of you may have heard of him. Wonderful Japanese scholar, journalist. He wrote a book called In Praise of Shadows and pointed out that in very dim Buddhist temples, there would be very little light, but maybe in Japanese temples, in the distance would be a tiny fragment of gold, which would pick up the minimum amount of light entering from the front. And just touching this strip of gold, that would show you where you want to go. I immediately thought, when I read that, of Newgrange and the light that comes at the winter solstice. When I went to live for a week at La Tourette, Le Corbusier's monastery, which then was occupied by Dominican monks, I found an interesting thing. The flat concrete ceiling of his abbey church, his monastery church, had been formed with steel square plates, but they weren't too tight together because dribbles of wet concrete, cement, came through between the plates, just tiny dribbles. There were strips all across the ceiling, and it formed a network, a rectangular network of dribbles of cement. Any other builder or architect might have said, sand those off, they're terrible, they spoil the beautiful surface. Le Corbusier said, no. When the setting sun comes in through the slot, the light slot that runs all the way around that building, like the light slot at the top of a Baroque church, but it's only 6 inches deep here, it filters in horizontally, touches those excrescences of concrete and cement, makes a network, a spider work, a cobweb of gold. There's an opening in the middle of the space that helps the organist and the reader to see what they're doing. There are tiny diagonal slots along the sides behind the monks' stalls to enable them, and these are colored lights, enable them to read their texts at Compline and the Divine Office. Good heavens, this doesn't look at all the kind of thing we should have been thinking about in those days. A friend asked me to oblige a friend of hers. She was an architect and was extremely busy and couldn't oblige her friend, who wanted to build a small hotel in Italy. Could I please do it? So I said, okay. And I met Michael Graham, ex-racing car driver, World War II flying ace, who with some friends, going the wrong way, with some friends, had purchased this plot of land in Monte Argentina, north of Rome, about 90 kilometers, near a place called Oratory. And his friends, which included Prince Tinte Borghese, one of the great Borghese family, a filmmaker, and Adrian Conan Doyle, the son of Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote all the Sherlock Holmes novels. They had bought this and they wanted this piece of land and they wanted to build a small hotel. So I produced this little watercolor rendering after we had made some plans and sections and so on. He gave me a very good topo survey of the site, and that was very useful. It was came from the Commissione delle Belle Arti in Siena. And so we walked. He flew me to the site after I had done this sketch study. Flew me over to Italy, drove me from Rome in his Porsche, way up, driving as a race car driver does, with my tongue in my cheeks with terror. We arrived at the site, walked out, and I felt uneasy. I looked over the cliff, felt very uneasy. And after a while, I started pacing, and I said to Michael, we have a problem. He said, what's that? I said, you've got 3 bedrooms in the sea. The topo survey was 300 years old. And in those 300 years, storms had eroded the cliff edge by about an inch a year. So it had lost about 300 inches. We had 3 bedrooms in the sea. What to do? They had a meeting of the group, about 12 of them. And I said, if I could find a place to draw, I could redo it right here. Borghese happened to have a very good drafting table and drafting instruments in his library. He lived nearby. He had a house nearby. He was going over to the island of Giglio, which is off this coast, where you may remember a great Italian cruise ship was shipwrecked a couple of years ago. You saw it all over television. You can see it from this hotel. So Borghese lent me his studio, his butler, and his maid, his cook, sorry, for 3 days. I worked 2 days and 2 nights and half a day. Oops, this is going crazy on me. What is going on here? And I finally came up with this revised design. It gathers around a series of terraces. There is a ramp now for accessibility. Gathered around this series of terraces, and we placed a piñata, a grove of small pines, which grew and formed eventually, when I saw it in 1880, a canopy of greenery with these stalks back to my Brussels sprouts patch. A few years later, well, quite a number of years later, about 3 years ago, I was in the American Academy at Rome. My wife and I were staying there, doing a little enjoyment. And there was a studio party, a reception in the studio for, oh dear, this is terrible, for one of the fellows who was having an exhibition. And who turns up but Peter Eisenman, sees me across the room, comes over, gives me a hug, and says, what are you doing here? I said, same question to you. He said, oh, the Italians are giving me some kind of an award. I thought I'd come over. And I said, well, I have a fellowship here. I'm a fellow here. I can visit here. He said, oh, he said, have you ever done anything in Italy? And I said, well, yes. I mean, here's this great postmodern architect. I didn't want to tell him I'd done a humble kind of traditional local materials building 30 years earlier. And I said, yeah, I did a little hotel north of here in a place called, near Oratory. He said, what's it called? I said, Il Pelicano. He said, you designed Il Pelicano? I thought he was going to kill me. He said, no. He said, my family and I consider that the most wonderful hotel in the world. We've spent our vacations, summer vacations there every year. Peter could have knocked me down. I said, you go there? He said, yes. We've been there every summer for years, since my family was growing up. His wife said, that's true. I said, Peter, you have made my day, my month, my year, my life. Now, we go back to the 16th century. Dunluce Castle in the north of Ireland, cliffside castle, built in Elizabethan times when the British occupied all of this part of Northern Ireland. It looks over on the other side, just around the far side is Royal Portrush Golf Course, where the horrendous British Open Championship was held in terrible weather last year, much to the chagrin of the Americans when they saw the Irishmen win it. This, in the 18th century, sometime in the 18th century, they were having a great party in this castle, wonderful place, and the food and wine were flowing, and they were having a great dance and all the rest. And suddenly, sometime in the middle of the night, there was a great roaring, tumbling, thunderous sound. The entire kitchen area and all adjacent areas had fallen into the sea. So you see, I spared Michael Graham from that happening to his hotel. I finally got back to see my fairy castle in 1980. I went to Mount Athos. In those days, it was a very difficult journey across rugged mountain roads in rickety buses. Then you had to, first of all, you had to go to Thessaloniki to get permission and get the consul to say you were okay. Then you had to go with these rickety buses across to a place called Uranopolis, a small port, from which it took a little boat that was really not capable of carrying the 30 monks and pilgrims that it carried, to another port called Daphne, and then a rickety bus across a very dangerous dirt road to the capital of Mount Athos. And then you hiked 3, maybe 4 hours on mountain trails across the peninsula. And we came, myself and a young Australian came, rounded a bend and saw this. We were struck, the sunlight on this in the evening, the setting sun, struck us silent for probably 10 minutes. I visited 4 other monasteries and finally decided I had to come back to this place. One only gets 4 days to spend there, and one can stay in the monasteries as their guest. And I stayed in 4 of them and said, I must come back to this place. I worked for a year with various authorities to try and get permission to come and live there for a month, and I finally managed to get it. And lived for a month on the mountain, documenting several monasteries, but particularly my fairy castle, the one I loved. The trail we first saw it on rounded a bend, and one entered it this way. One could have come by boat and climbed this rather strenuous trail to arrive up here. My research was published in an article in Places magazine. Remember Don Linden of Toward Making Places, who became head at MIT? He founded a magazine, a very good magazine called Places, still published. And they published this series of drawings I made of Mount Athos. And you can see in this plan the entrance up through a tunnel, up through some winding stairs, and up into a courtyard, which sits here. Final stairs is here. And en route, you come across strange intersections like this. Caves with winding staircases, vaults. Back to my cave origins again. Another view of the entrance, view of the gardens here, and my room right there at the tiny top. We shift gears again. A church in Chico, California, which I designed with my then partner, Francis Seiji Oda from Hawaii, graduate of Cornell. Brilliant architect who now has the biggest office in Hawaii, which is divided into small groups like our office was. We had never more than 8 people. Well, like Lucia, I never had more than 12. These are 2 churches, one in California, one in Troy, New York. What the heck brought me from sunny California to Troy, New York? Another story. This building got an AIA Honor Award. It was the only one from California that got one that year. There were 10 for the whole country out of many, many entries. And it has been published a number of times. I've got to go back. This little chapel in Troy, New York, the Eddy Chapel, is just off Burdett, the Eddy Memorial Center there, which is a geriatric center, essentially a center for retirees. This little chapel was added right at the entrance to the Eddy Chapel, of which are offices and the dining room and a garden, which is enclosed for the Alzheimer patients. Down below, through the trees here, well, trees on this drawing, there are rental apartments. Oh dear, dear me. Off to the right, the upper right, are single rooms, and then the intensive care area is here. This is right across from Samaritan Hospital, so there's a conjunction. The chapel is a simple volume, which is probably only the same size as the day chapel, which has in Chico, which has baptistry, confessionals, Blessed Sacrament Chapel, and Zen meditation garden. This is not at all dissimilar, except that it's only the size of that bit there. It's much smaller, for instance, than the Chapel and Cultural Center at RPI. But it consists of a central space, an apse, and a passage, and an entrance here. These walls can be folded back into these hollow columns, which echo, in my mind, Kahn's hollow columns in the first building I ever saw by him, the Trenton Bathhouse. And it can be divided for regular Christian services, which might look this way through a wonderful window behind the table, which is identical to the windows that characterize the existing building and look west beautifully. The very small Jewish community in this center, there are very few Jewish residents. The rabbi asked me if we could accommodate them. So sure, we built this space that could be separated again by a partition that folds back in. When the Catholic Mass is on Sunday, it occupies the whole space, and the altar table is placed in this apse, of which I have a photograph somewhere. A rather beautiful cherry table designed by Sid Fleischer, built by Sid Fleischer. Can you see that? I think you can. Sid Fleischer, who was the shop director for years at RPI, which brings me to another connection. At my very first meeting of the Society of Architectural Historians in Carmel, California, or Monterey, California, I was a young instructor at Berkeley, just there, still wet behind the ears. And I was honored to sit at a small table with three other people, Charles Moore, Sir George Trevelyan, who had founded the English version of the Society of Architectural Historians, and a tiny woman, a tiny architect called Hope Gladding. She had retired. She was up to my shoulder, and I'm pretty small. And we talked for a while afterwards about my beginning as a teacher of architecture. And she said, young man, teach them to use the wood shop. Well, I did. Jim Prestini and I used the wood shop tremendously with the students in Berkeley. And when I came to RPI, I found a wonderful wood shop on the top floor, run by a man called Lou. Oh dear, I can't remember Lou's second name offhand. Wonderful man who had terrific discipline, but he was succeeded by Sid Fleischer, who's retired now, still doing wonderful things. But Sid designed that beautiful table in this little chapel. A view of my sketches of the original apse cut off, and the general schema, the order of things. A roof light like in the middle of a square, cupola like the middle of Le Corbusier's building, but there's something else above this cupola. Back. If you look carefully, you see a flèche here. Not as grand as the flèche, the spire that collapsed during the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral, but a spire that is open metal, steel, fabricated by a local metal worker called Rick Keeler in Sound Lake. I was inspired to do this by the spire on, or the flèche on a church in Trastevere in Rome by Borromini, Francesco Borromini. And we use it as a lightning conductor. It's a symbol and a lightning conductor. So it conducts the lightning bursts to the floor. This is the program for the dedication of the Chapel and Cultural Center at RPI. I had met Tom Phelan, the pastor, at a 1966 conference in Houston, Texas, a national conference on religion and the arts, run by the Catholic Art Association, of which Tom was president. He showed Peter Levatich's design for the new Chapel and Cultural Center at RPI. I showed a couple of my churches in design stage in California. We hit it off rather well together. And I remember we both got yarmulkes from the local Jewish community when they entertained us at a Seder, and we both still had our yarmulkes 20 years ago as great souvenirs of our meeting. But Tom invited me a year later to come to the dedication of the Chapel and Cultural Center, and he would use the title of a book I was writing for this symposium he was to hold, which would include myself and 3 others. And he called it The End of Church Architecture. That was the title of the book I was writing. And he asked me, what did I mean by end? Surely that's not what we're talking about. I said, yes. It means finish of what we have seen and purpose of what ought to be. So that's pretty good. So use it for the symposium. 2 days before, I was looking forward to the symposium because he told me that the School of Architecture, under its dean, Keith McPheeters, was holding its annual Alcoa lecture that week, that Wednesday, in fact, the same Wednesday as we had our morning symposium. And Aldo van Eyck would be, from Amsterdam, would be the guest speaker, the Alcoa lecturer. I said, this is great. But 2 days before I was to fly, I had a telephone call from Keith McPheeters, the dean at RPI, School of Architecture. And he said, I have had some bad news. I said, oh, it's canceled? And he said, no. Aldo van Eyck broke his leg. I said, oh my God, that was part of the reason why I was coming to see him in your Alcoa lecture. He said, yes. And I asked him at this short notice, who can we possibly get? And Aldo van Eyck said, ask Patrick Quinn. I had met him. I'd gone to see him in Amsterdam and formed a friendship with him. So that's how I came to speak at RPI Schools of Architecture lecture, the Alcoa lecture, in October 1968, in place of Aldo van Eyck. I spoke at short notice. I spoke about my then very limited body of work to all the assembled architecture students and some local practitioners in the Chapel and Cultural Center. 3 years later, I was invited to be dean at RPI. 10 years before that, I didn't know where RPI was. I didn't know about Troy much, but here I was invited to be dean. And so, you see, the reason I'm here tonight is because Aldo van Eyck broke his leg. While I was at RPI, 2 great things we did, at least in my mind. In 1972, a student, Alan Greenberger, distinguished architect from Philadelphia now, former director of planning in the city of Philadelphia, and a distinguished professor now at Temple University, I think he is. He and I, with 3 other students, tried to remember their names, Frank Grauman, Tom Quirk, Bill Commoners. We put together, I had brought with me an international conference in the School of Architecture, whose subject was discussion and talking across disciplines, across disciplinary boundaries. In American universities in those days, each discipline was sacrosanct. They had their own PhD programs. Never would there be interaction between them. So I had brought this from Berkeley, where we'd had to cancel it because Ronald Reagan, then governor, later president, had surrounded the campus with fixed bayonets of the National Guard and caused many of my students to be tear gassed. and babies in the local hospital. And he had canceled our Archimedia conference. And we had people, he closed the campus effectively because there was a law that no more than 6 people could gather in public. My family was illegal when we stood on our front lawn as the tear gas and smoke flames emerged from Telegraph Avenue during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. We had these people, famous people, in the air. We had to cancel them and stop them as we could, and the conference was over. I had decided to bring it to RPI because the idea was too good. And Greenberger and these, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as I call them, they helped me to put on this show, and we had people like Buckminster Fuller and Charles Jenks, whom I had hired, given his first job to, so-called the father of postmodernism. We gave him his first job at RPI. All sorts of great people. Edward T. Hall, who had written The Hidden Dimension. Oh, so many great people. Some of my former students who are now distinguished in the world came, and we held Archimedia. And it was the first interdisciplinary conference or cross-disciplinary conference in RPI, and certainly I think in any university in America. It is not listed in RPI's history, but it was a great conference. Many people loved it. Other things we did at RPI, well, some of us, under the tutelage of a great coach, Jeff Matthews, founded the RPI Master Swimming Club. Oops, sorry. While I was at RPI as a teacher, I was just close to or just after retirement, I think it was, when Tom Phelan called me and said, we don't have enough storage space in the CNCC. You know the CNCC, entrance here, corridor into the church, baptistry, lounge behind, emergency exit, gathering for cocktails or coffee, and a gathering place outside. Very simple. They ran out of storage space. We need additional storage. We think it should be over here against the existing wall. So I worked on it, and we produced this. Tom was rather upset because he said, why is it curved? After all, the rest of the building is rectangular. I said, wait and see. It'll bring things together. Now, of course, we had to extend this platform and extend its steps. We had to extend this platform and extend its steps, like so. And the curve and these steps bring together to make a place, 2 disparate places. The roof is drained by something that I first noticed in Le Corbusier's chapel at Rensselaer, a spout and a receptacle. And underneath that is a window of glass bricks that illuminates the storage cabinet where all the chairs are stored, and a window here that allows the office to extend over to here. Very simple building. The smallest building I ever did. Although in the chapel, I had the smallest theatrical role I ever had. RPI faculty put on a play once. They had a play group, and I had one role, one line. It was, you called, sir. Very symbolic. That was all I had to say. 10 seconds, maybe a 5-second appearance. Anyway, this was the Chapel and Cultural Center, whose original pastor was one of the reasons for me coming to RPI. And this was the RPI Masters team, part of the Adirondack Masters, which is a branch of the US Masters and the World Masters. And we designed a banner that we used at the Canadian National Championships, where Colonel Ray Bellum, head of ROTC, Mike, I've forgotten Mike's name, an antique evaluator from Albany, Professor Brian Head, Professor of Portuguese at University of Albany, Patrick Quinn of RPI, and Colonel Bellum's wife, who was an independent black breaststroke swimmer. But the 4 of us made a world's top 10 record in the 4x 800 meters relay. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I've gone, I'm sure, way over my time. I forgot to put a clock here, but I've probably gone way over. Is Evan still there?
Patrick, fantastic. If we were in MPAC, there would be a huge round of applause, and you certainly deserve it. That was an extraordinary lecture for so many reasons. Why don't I share with our audience what the structure of this second format, how it'll work out. I want to ask you a set of questions and open up a dialogue with you, and then at some moment, turn it over to the student body, and certainly guests and friends and family who I'm sure they have a lot of questions for you. Wow. You know, where do we start? Maybe my first comment is an observation, Patrick, and it looks like you put an enormous effort into figuring out how to structure the story of your life. Maybe
that wasn't the intention, but it worked out that way.
No, I found myself, and I come out of, although I'm slightly younger, I come out of an era where we also drew manually, and sketching was simply part of the way we thought and conceptualized and created in the world. So during your lecture, I found myself listening simultaneously to the lessons and insight and profound kind of teachings of your life's work, but at the same time trying to examine the kind of complexity of this rich life, and to the extent that you were trying to invite us all in to many years of experience, it seemed like there was a non-linear strategy. In other words, there was an amalgamation of sketches and photographs of existing historical buildings, of contemporary buildings that you built, of photos of great mentors, and sketches that you had made throughout your life, which were an attempt to do a kind of deep dive into the kind of profound insight of these historical precedents. But you presented it in a kind of a non-linear, non-chronological manner, which I thought was, I mean, obviously it was purposeful, it was explicitly intended to tell us something. And I'm on that note, my sense is that you have a different way of engaging history, and it's certainly not traditional, and it raises a whole question of a kind of unpredictable chance, and the way in which time is not a straight line, but it's about bending it continuously in order to revisit things from the past, in order to understand their value in a contemporary world. So maybe my first question to you is, how do you interpret the relationship between history, the present, and the future?
I thought I had already done that, but that's a question that requires a semester to answer.
No, I know that, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Maybe I should have prefaced by saying that there are traps often in architectural education, and maybe for that matter, in just higher education,
Maybe.
where we deliver knowledge in these buckets and these silos, and history is often misinterpreted as something that is enclosed in a kind of inert envelope. And yet you have a masterful control and understanding on how to open history in a beautiful way where it has value and merit in the world that we live in today.
Maybe I can answer your question by telling you that when I was a second-year student, I went to work. First of all, I worked in architects' offices. We were required to in summers for a pittance. One of my colleagues presented to the boss one day when we were second-year students. He presented a bottle of Chianti. And Jack Elwood, the architect, came in and said, "What the hell is this, Crowther? Drinking on the job?" And Bobby Crowther, who was English, looked up and said, "That, sir, is my salary." We got 10 shillings a week, out of which they took 1 11 for, insurance and taxation and that sort of thing. 10 shillings in those days was about $2 for a week. You couldn't live on that, of course, but we got the experience. Well, one summer in 1952, my second year, I think it was, 51 or 52, I decided to go and work in a student farm camp in Wisbech in Cambridgeshire in England. Now, England was still pretty shot up after the war, and so the journey across England after traveling across from Ireland by boat, the journey was bus, train. I had my bicycle with me and pannier bags, and I would unload it from a train, ride a bit, get another bus, get another train, so on. It took me a day to get across, a couple of 100 miles. And the train stopped in a place called Peterborough. And it was going to stop for a couple of hours. Well, Wisbech was too far away for me to ride, so I decided I'd take the bike on a bus. And meanwhile, I had a couple of hours to spare, and I could go up the town of Peterborough. And there was a film on I wanted to see called Never Take No for an Answer, a wonderful Italian film, which I saw. It took an hour. On the way back, I passed an opening in this medieval row, a dark opening, a tunnel, a cave-like tunnel. I walked through it, and before me opened up the facade of Peterborough Cathedral. Now, if you've never seen Peterborough Cathedral, it is unique in the world. Its facade has 3 enormous arches, probably 30 feet high, 8 feet wide, 10 feet wide, something like that, but it soars. It's a Norman cathedral. Now, I had seen Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin and St. Patrick's. Well, they're chicken feed compared to Peterborough. Peter just had me shocked to the gills. And I walked through it, and I wasn't one terribly enamored of history. After all, I wanted to do some research in advanced concrete technology, change the world, that sort of thing. Despite Kahn, who helped me to do it, but never cathedrals. What the hell, cathedrals? I never went into St. Patrick's Cathedral. I passed by it and passed by Christ Church Cathedral, which had a lovely arch over the street, but never went in. I wasn't interested. This thing blew me away. I could never forget it. Walked around, started to read about it. At the farm camp, in which was a group of international students from all over, including a wonderful Danish oars woman, competitive scholar, and a wonderful medical student from the South Pacific, who spoke a strange language that he taught me. At weekends, we had time off, and 3 or 4 of us would go and visit old churches and cathedrals. And I gradually began to see, hey, this is not so boring after all. There's some stuff here that is worth looking at. And I started drawing, and I drew old churches in Kingsley, chapels in King's Lynn. I drew the fantastic small round church in Cambridge, which is still there today. Absolutely marvelous 10th century round church. This is how I got into history.
Right.
I was bored by history, although I managed to pass exams in it very well, but all you have to do is remember this stuff. But I got bored by it. And then when I met Lou Kahn, he fed the flames of that inquiry, because he wasn't an historian, but every now and again he'd bring in the huge folio copies from the Franklin Library of Palladio's Quattro Libri, his 4 books of architecture. And as a second year student, I had fallen in love with Palladio's famous villa at Vicenza. No, you all know it. Palladio's famous villa. And Lou Kahn would talk about Roman buildings in a way that made you think they were full of life today. Anyway, so it was a kind of continuing accident. As I wrote once in a publication called Who's Who in America, they ask you, write something about yourself. I wrote, I backed into everything I did.
Mm-hmm.
I backed into teaching. I backed into architecture because I wanted to be a painter, but there was no money in it. I backed into teaching because I thought I could find some spare, I was told there'd be spare time to do research and do architecture. Well, it wasn't that easy. I backed into everything I did. I backed into RPI. And I wrote at the end of it, who knows what I'll back into next? Maybe a truck. My children like that line. So in answer to your question, it's a continuing accident. It happens daily to me. Still, you know I found the Rutland Mill only about 6 months ago among some old maps. I think I have a copy of one back there on the shelf. Some old 18th century maps. So it's accident. It's not planned.
Right. But it's interesting to look at your life as a form of practices. I mean, more specifically, this genuine love and appreciation for these historical buildings, monasteries and caves, and ancient structures that hold clues about the world. There's a kind of mystery embedded in them, and you, I mean, your life's project is a kind of testimony to the importance and the profound value of reading architecture in a creative way. And you underscored again and again the importance of traveling.
I lost you.
Can you hear me?
What happened? I can't hear you. Oh, you're back.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'll say that again.
Yeah.
Your life's work is a testimony
You're
to
gone. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me.
What on earth is happening here?
Patrick, can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
Okay.
It says my internet connection is unstable. We need Robert, perhaps.
Well, let's cross our fingers and hope that.
Maybe we should get on to some student questions, because you're flattering me beyond any reasonable.
No, let me ask you a few more questions before we move on. So I want
to. I see some of my former students here in the background. I see Frank Pitts.
Yeah.
I see Frank Grumman, a former colleague. I see Neil McIndoe from London. But I don't see any of the regular students.
Patrick, one of the opportunities afforded here obviously is to inspire the next generation of students. And although I think we have one of the most robust study abroad programs of any architecture school in the United States, to your credit, because you established the Rome Studies program, the fact is that visiting these historical buildings have had a profound impact on the way you see the world and how you've chosen to interpret the past in relation to the creation of contemporary buildings. And you have an amazing skill of drawing as a way of reading and listening to the kind of deep structure of these buildings. many students of this generation, although they may go abroad for a semester, there's an impulse to get a job right away.
Ah, yes.
Right, to kind of move into a more secure territory. What I loved about what you were describing to us is it was.
Can I hold you there for a moment?
Yeah.
About the job getting. As I told you, I wanted to be an artist. I was pretty good painter, artist. And one day I wrote to the Lord Mayor of Dublin, John McCann. He happened to be a playwright. I was 15. He was a playwright and the Lord Mayor. And he had, in his official capacity, presented me with a prize I had won in a competition, an open competition. And he added a prize of something I think was £2, something marvelous, you know, of $8. But to me, as a 15-year-old, that was a fortune. So my father said, you've got to write and thank the Lord Mayor. Because I had been most embarrassed to meet him when I ran back to the track where I was watching John Joe Barry break the Irish record for the 1500 meters, because I was a track man. Anyway, I wrote this letter to the Lord Mayor, and he wrote back, art never flourished in a garret. Get yourself a sheet anchor and then find time to begin and develop your art. It was just a postcard. My father said, good advice. You can't make a living as an artist in this country. That's why so many of our artists go abroad. So I said, okay. And I won a position by competition in the local civil service, the Dublin Corporation, actually. Two of us from my school were first and second in the competition, and we ended up working in the city manager's office as junior clerks. The other guy eventually became city manager himself. I got bored with the work. I could do it in a day and a half, and then I would design bookmarks for the city manager's rent books. See, I suppose some of them are still there. Oh, beautiful little doodles of cottages and that sort of thing. And one day I was asked to bring a message over to the city architect, Conor McGinley. And I went up and knocked on his door, and he said, you know, you should have given this to a porter down below who would give it to a receptionist, who would give it to a secretary, who would give it to my assistant and bring it up to me. I said, but I came up, you're here. I just knocked on his door. He said, sit down, and we talked. He wanted to know what I did with myself, why I was there. I told him my background. I wanted to be an artist, and I told him about John McCann's letter. And he said, you ever considered architecture? I said, my father had mentioned that architects draw too. And that was true in those days. And I said, yeah, but is there a future in it? He said, there's enough work in this city to keep architects going for 20 years. I said, hell, that's an eternity. That's okay for me. Mm-hmm. So instead of entering the National College of Art, I entered University College Dublin School of Architecture. I had a scholarship and I had to choose. And that's how I ended up in architecture. So again, I backed in, but it was a question of the job.
Right.
I needed a job that would allow me to be an artist. It took me until my 4th year to realize that architecture was far more than just drawing and illustration and that sort of thing, and building and construction. Because in my 4th year, I was doing a design for, I'd been to Rome by this, no, I hadn't, had I? Yes, I'd been to Rome on a 2-week trip and hitchhiked back across the continent. I led the tour to Rome because the professor got ill and couldn't lead it. And so we got lost in Rome on the way there. We hadn't a clue. We were fish out of water, but we had a great time. In any case, I came back, and the first project we had to do, I somehow couldn't manage it. You know, students will know. You come up against a stone wall and you can't go any further, and it looks lousy. It really is a piece of crap. You cannot go any further. That happened to me. I tore up the drawings, tore them up. They were already done on finished sheets. I tore them up, started again, At weekend, I completed a new scheme and I got an honors. I think that sort of experience shapes the person. And everybody goes through this in every field. And some learn from it, some don't. I think I learned from it. You know? So that's one of the things that students should understand. Yes, it's important to get something that's paid, but don't just go into a dead-end job that's going to pay you money and pay your insurance and your health for the rest of your life and kill your creativity. I told you about Nakashima.
Yeah.
He sold his car so he could go around the world. He ended up being interned as a political prisoner, even though he was an American citizen. He became the greatest woodworker in the world because in the camp, he learned from a Japanese carpenter and he became a perfectionist. His furniture is in the Chapel and Cultural Center. Okay, I'm sorry,
No,
too long.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Patrick. Here's a question from Frank Pitts, who you know.
Hello, Frank.
I'm going to read it out loud. Making a distinction between loving architecture and loving architects. We've always known about the first, but I suspect that your secret gift is the second. That at least.
I'm sorry, I was interrupted. My daughter handed me something telling me not to talk so long. But what was it you said again, Frank?
I'll read it again. Making a distinction between loving architecture and loving architects. We've always known about the first, but I suspect that your secret gift is the second. That at least has been my experience of you. Would you be willing to talk about this? Great question, Frank.
I don't love all architects. Love is a thing, in any relationship, love is a thing that's earned. That's all.
Okay, we'll certainly take more questions, and as they come in, until they come in. I was just curious, Patrick, one of your earlier projects, the Parish Church, you had mentioned Recollet, and your interest in exploring his interest in exploring minimal surfaces and the inspiration you inherited. Just out of curiosity as a form of expression, you abandoned this language later on in favor, and I'm talking about a direct interest in the structural system and mathematics that came with that research as your primary source, in favor of something else. But
it wasn't in favor of something else. It was just I never got the chance to test out the other things. You know, you get what comes. I never went looking for work.
Right.
It happened through coincidences and accidents, meeting people in bars and all sorts of things, you know. They all just happen. I mean, and I never did seek to be a huge firm or to build in pre-stressed concrete. There were enough people doing that. T.Y. Lin, for instance, great friend of mine. I had him talk at RPI. He designed the most amazing stuff in concrete, and he was doing that as an engineer. There were enough people around the world doing that sort of thing that would thrill the life out of me. I was happy to settle for anything that enabled me to just enjoy or to find the joy of architecture. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know. I designed...
Go ahead.
The last and smallest project I did was 10 years ago when we moved into this house. You are in the garage. I'm in the garage.
Yes, yes.
It used to be the back end of the garage, which is 2 feet, the floor is 2 feet down. It was a workshop for the former owner, but my work is this. So we built this studio out of the back of the garage, and it works beautifully. It's the nicest room I've ever worked in. So I love it. And it was ad hoc.
You've been, I said this to you earlier, actually, before the lecture started, Patrick. I get a sense you were, and and I mean this in a sincere way, you've been touched by angels. I mean,
Well, a few.
yeah, some really some of the giants in the late part of the 20th century.
You're gone again.
What's that? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Come on.
Yeah, can you? All right. I mean,
That's better.
you studied with Kahn, Recollet. You brought, I assume you brought Bucky Fuller to RPI.
Alan Greenberger and I brought Bucky Fuller to RPI, and that's, but I'd met him before that. We brought him for Archimedia, and he spoke for, I think, 4 hours. And when I first met him in Barcelona, he was lost. He was coming to that international students conference, and I was supposed to be a North American advisor to the student conference. And not Barcelona, yes, it was Barcelona. And Bucky was lost in this restaurant, but I never met him, but I recognized that big domed head. And I walked over and said, Mr. Fuller. He said, yes, yes, I'm looking for some students. Do you know where they might be? Well, the students were not there, but he ended up speaking to the students there for about 4 hours over, and then we took the interpreter to a place to have, what is the word, a great dish, the Spanish equivalent of pizza, but it's not much better than pizza. Bucky got carried away and ended up showing us his flamenco dance. He had invented a flamenco dance. And they cleared off the table in the restaurant, and he stood on the table and did his flamenco dance. Years later, he's at RPI, not at Archimedia, but when our son Kieran brought him much later as a speaker at the Student Union, or maybe it was the time he got an honorary degree, but he spoke so long that there were no restaurants open in Troy. In those days, there were only
You're still there,
Patrick? Places you could eat in. Spoon. Sorry?
We lost you for a second.
It was awful. And Bucky said, I'm hungry. He'd had no food. And we looked, all the restaurants were closed. And I said, come on home. What do you need? He said, just some scrambled eggs on toast, a bit of fruit. I said, come on home. So we came home at midnight and 1 a.m. or something. And our 4 boys were around. And we sat around the dining table and made scrambled eggs and toast and a pear for Bucky. And he got involved with the kids, talking away, just as Luke Kahn got involved with our kids. That's another story. But Bucky, Paul, one of our sons, said, Mr. Fuller, our father says you have invented a Spanish dance and you did it on a table in Barcelona. Is that true? Or is it one of our father's stories? He said, no, it's true. Would you like to see it? So he went out into the hall where there was some exposed wood, and he did his zapateado, as he called it. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly a door opened upstairs and a voice said, who the hell is making that racket? It was Maureen coming out of the bedroom where she'd been asleep. And he looked up and he said, it's only Bucky there. And she said, well, I don't care who the hell it is. I'm trying to sleep. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. Why don't you go home? He said, just go, dear. He loved Maureen. He really did. But she minced no words when talking to God or anything else, you know. So that was Bucky.
Did you interpret him as a paradigm shift? In other words, a futurist that was telling us something about the planet and how certain existential threats that we're facing today would ultimately arrive and threaten the human species?
Very much so. Because one of the things at Berkeley in the newly founded College of Environmental Design that we were very concerned with was things that had been brought to our attention by Rachel Carson, who wrote The Silent Spring and the Sea Around Us, portending the destruction of the planet in 1958. And Ian McHarg in Penn who directed landscape architecture there and developed into an amazing department now that studies everything from biology to ecology to climatology about the future of the planet. And we were all very concerned with that. Bucky, of course, fitted in beautifully with the question, because one of the first things he said to me as we were walking around Troy together, looking at the old buildings, that the Gateway, of which Tom and I were founders, was trying to preserve industrial buildings. Bucky said, there's a question you should ask your students. I said, what's that? How much does your building weigh?
Right.
Back to the soap film. How much does your building weigh?
Right.
Great question. That was Bucky. But he also talked about how, he gave an illustration of how a carton of butter transported from one country to the other satisfies trade on every border it crosses and travels all across Europe through Russia and back, finally ends up back in France. Same carton of butter, but it has made profit for dozens of people around. He was talking about international trade and how it needed to change.
You know, at that time, Patrick, was he well received or
Oh yeah, they loved him. He would speak, they would be, well, I think some of the people who are listening in here, I know Frank Pitts was probably there, Neil Macken, I see Neil Mackendale, they were there, Frank Grauman was there. They can speak to that.
Right. Here's a question from Emily McDougall. Thank you for an amazing lecture. As a fifth-year student developing my thesis around the role of history in architecture, I was deeply inspired by your work and the examples you provided. Your ideas speak a lot about the role history plays in modern and contemporary architecture. But what role do you think contemporary architecture can play in the historical?
Wow. That's a great question.
That's a good one.
God. And her thesis is on history and architecture?
Yeah, she doesn't tell us more about that. Maybe she can now, but on the role of history in architecture.
That's a great question. It's terrific because, you know, some great things are lost in history. One of my inspirations way back was Herman Hahn, a Dutch architect. Nobody knows Herman Hahn in history, but recently one of his houses, beautiful modern house in the style, I suppose, of De Stijl, sold for $2.5 million, a house not much bigger than this. And this is a cottage, really. Herman Hahn was a young architectural student, and he borrowed 100 guilders from his father and went off to the Sahara Desert to study how they lived around the edges of the Sahara Desert. He discovered that many of them lived underground or in the faces of hollows in the ground in caves, rather like the town of Matera in South, where you can go 6 stories down and have a nice cup of coffee in fresh air with cold, beautiful, fresh water from below, 6 stories below the ground, the underground city of Kimackley. Well, how the heck did I get to that? Suddenly Kimackley. Oh, Herman Hahn wrote an essay called Life in the Desert in a book that came out in 1959 by Oscar Newman called New Frontiers in Architecture. There were 10 or 12 people at this conference in Otterloo. The Smithsons, Alison and Peter Smithson, Lou Kahn, Aldo Van Eyck, who was one of the organizers, Jacob Bachema, all these historical figures were there. There's a couple of great Italians, Giancarlo Di Carlo, who was a great favorite in the 60s of RPI students, particularly of Bob Winnie and Ken Warner, who were professors at that time. But Herman Hahn wrote about life in the desert. And 2 of us, reading this years later, Amos Rappaport and I, he has published about 26 books on environmental design now, who went around the world with a sketch pad and fruit boots, and drew everything from the desert to the city all over the world. It came to Berkeley as a faculty member, now at Milwaukee. But Kahn described something almost like that monastery that I showed you in Castel Sant'Elia in the Gorge. And the latest news from Matera in the south of Italy, where after the war, American money helped to build modern houses that the poor people who lived in the caves on the cliff face could move into and be more comfortable. They'd have air conditioning, maybe, and all that sort of thing. Recently, the people of Matera have started to move back into the caves, probably for two reasons. One, they're quieter, they're cooler, climatologically apposite. But here's a case of a great scholar, Hermann Hahn, great architect, lost to history. You won't find him in any of the history books, except this one. And I lent this wonderful book to a student at RPI. I've forgotten what student I lent it to, but I never got it back, and I can't find it anywhere. Wonderful book. I met Oscar Newman years later when I was leading a tour of 40 American architects through 6 Russian cities, or Soviet cities. And I found Newman not to be the kind of person. You asked if I loved architects. No, I don't love all architects. He had moved way beyond that publication and moved into other areas that were, not nearly as attractive. Anyway, that's one answer to your question, but there's so many others. Alice Meynell, I mentioned. Alice the poet, who wrote Spirit of Place in 1898. And you never hear of her in poetry or history today. But I have her book behind me, my father's book. So in answer to Miss McDougall, was it?
Yes. Emily, yes.
Emily McDougall. Keep going. Just search. There are no answers.
Yeah. Patrick,
except those you unravel and discover for yourself.
Thank you. This is from Caroline. Thank you for an amazing lecture and for establishing the Roman Studies program. I attended the last fall and loved every minute of it. My question to you is, what is the best tip you've ever given or received about sketching while traveling or sketching in the field?
I don't remember any tips. I really don't. The only tip about drawing I got was from my father when I was very young. When I was 5, I did a portrait of him, a profile, which is one of the best drawings I ever did, and it disappeared when I moved to this country. I don't know what became of it. I still remember it as one of my best drawings. But I decided, I was very much in love with athletics, and in high school I was a hurdler, believe it or not, 120 yards hurdler, same as 110 meters. And when the hurdles got too high for me, I changed to middle distance running. But I was copying a photograph of the great Harrison Dillard, who was the most beautiful hurdler in the world in the 1948 Olympics, which I couldn't attend, I couldn't afford, but it was just across the water. Anyway, they published these wonderful photographs of the athletes, and Harrison Dillard was amazing. He floated, like some ethereal being at high speed. And I decided I must be a hurdler, but I must find out more. So I kept drawing from pictures of Harrison Dillard so I could find out what the action was. My father I was very dissatisfied with the drawings, and my father saw them one day and he said, I have a tip for you. Turn the photo upside down. Then you'll copy it exactly. You'll get the right movement. He was right. I turned the photo upside down. I wasn't interpreting anymore, or interpreting. I was just drawing, But I don't recommend copying as a way to learn to draw at all.
Patrick, here's another one. Thank you on that.
Okay.
This is from Eugene Sim, 1980.
Good Lord.
From San Francisco. Wonderful presentation. I appreciate.
Wonderful student.
Yeah.
Fabulous student.
I appreciate you mentioning George Nikashima. I had an opportunity to visit with his daughter, Mira.
Mira, yes.
Who currently runs his Legacy Foundation outside of New Hope, Pennsylvania, a couple of years ago, which
she wrote to me 3 days ago.
Which I've been to. It's extraordinary. Everyone should go. Are you familiar with his beautiful woodwork shop and his later work as a furniture maker?
I knew him first as a furniture maker. I didn't know him as a furniture maker, but I knew the furniture because I had seen it. Tom Phelan had brought it to my attention when I arrived at RPI, the furniture in the Chapel and Cultural Center. And I said, I've got to use this guy sometime. And when I was designing the church in Florida, the pastor came up. I said, we've got to go see George Nakashima in New Hope, Pennsylvania. We went to see him, and my Lord, that man's work was something ordinary craftsmen cannot do. It was inspired and also incredibly precise and detailed. And what really turned me on to George Nakashima first was Tom Phelan's circular dining table. Nakashima explained how it came about. Somebody had it was a beautiful piece of walnut that they'd take from a tree in Oregon, and when it was being knocked down, and somebody's power saw had slipped and cut a gash. They had cut the table, they had made 2 semicircular pieces cut from this tree section, and the saw had slipped. And if you consider a semicircle, and at the bottom of the semicircle, there's a slice. The piece was destroyed. No, they sliced it in 2, that semicircle, and flipped it. And now with the central joints going down and the 2 gashes on either side, you have a peace symbol. So it was Tom's piece. So again, accidents, even with the greatest craftsmen, can be turned into beauty. Yes, I know George Nakashima's thing, and we went and spent time in New Hope. Mira was just a young girl then. She hadn't started working on the furniture with him. And unfortunately, he was ready to design, to make the chairs and altar and lectern for the chapel, for the church in Boca Raton. The pastorship was changed. The priest I worked with whom I'm still in touch, brilliant liturgiologist. I talked to him just this afternoon. He's 94. He was replaced by the bishop, not a very sensitive bishop, and replaced with a man who was much more materialistic and who said, we can't afford George Nakashima. I'll get some church furniture from my friends in Dublin. He was from Cork, from Ireland. He also owned horses and was more interested in the horses than the liturgy, I think. And so we didn't get George Nakashima. It was a cause of great sorrow to me because I had to design the altar and the lectern and the chapel and the tabernacle. And George Nakashima would have done a far better job than I did, you know. But there you are.
Yeah,
Does
Patrick.
that adequately answer Caroline's question?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Did she say yes?
She came back and, hold on a second here. Oh, Caroline. Yes, she did.
Okay.
All right. David, and I may be mispronouncing his last name, Lisetti.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to
read a while back.
I'm going to read this. Professor Quinn, I presented a final crit to you in 1987, a vertical studio. I entered the gallery, yourself and Frank Pitts and faculty stood up and applauded as I entered. And you said in quotes, "You've got it. Don't change a thing. This was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. May your life be blessed with the peaceful, romantic heart you have. All the best. Davide Lisetti." Well, back to earlier question or
I
comment.
remember that. But let me tell you something where I was nasty to a student. This is important too. You're not always kind. And sometimes students are not kind to professors and students aren't kind to professors. He brings to mind two students. There was a student at Berkeley called Robert Allen. How can I forget his name? So long ago.
Yeah.
60 years ago. Robert Allen was not doing very well. He was a third-year studio. And he somehow never got his work in on time. And it was not great. He was a nice fellow, but I thought, I've got to teach this man a lesson. I said, you're going to have to repeat this in the fall. I'm giving you an F. And he pleaded with me and he said, look, and he told me he had a family of 5. He was working at nights as a film projection room operator and partly as a janitor. And I said, oh my God, what am I doing? 5 kids? We had 6. And here was this student trying hard and he couldn't afford to drop out of school. He said, give me a month and put the hardest jury from the faculty you can gather onto me and see if I can pass. I put Joe Escherich, Donald Olson, and Jesse Rychek. They were tough guys on his case, and we gave him a B. Let me get something.
This is not intermission. Please stay with us. And Patrick will be back.
Hold on a second.
No problem.
I can't find it. It has moved. It has moved. Robert, the next day, placed in my mailbox a copy of Teilhard de Chardin's The Phenomenon of Man. I had never heard of it. Turns out one of the great books of the century, with a little dedication and thanks to me. Second item. Years ago, the engineering dean asked me to take on some engineering students because they weren't getting, civil students, they weren't getting enough enrollment, and they needed to offer some alternative choices to the engineers so that they would get some more civil engineering students. He asked me if I could take some students into the first year theory class, the introduction. We used to call it intro, as Frank Pitts will remember. And so I said, okay, give me money for extra teaching assistants and we'll do it. So in addition to those students, we started to get transfer students who wanted to study architecture. We got about 20 engineers in addition to 50 architects and about 10 transfer students who already had degrees in other fields. Very bright guys. One of them, we call him David, had worked for GE. He was a sociologist, brilliant guy. And during the lectures in the CNCC 100, I started off by saying, look, anybody who's puzzled, stop and ask me a question. Well, this is meant particularly for the freshmen, but this guy, David, he had questions all the time and he would dominate the class. And they had presentations to the faculty at the end. I'd invite the whole faculty to see what the intro students were doing. Some of them did wonderful stuff. And David had a pretty good presentation. And during his presentation, he addressed me by my first name. And I said, now I'd come from a rather different kind of culture, you know, originally. You never addressed the professor by his first name. Good Lord. And David kept doing this. And finally, I complimented him when the faculty stopped their question. I complimented him on doing a very good job. And I said, but I said, one of the things I noticed is you like to be familiar with people around you, including your professors. I said, you know, it's the most familiar thing you can do is use their nickname. I said, I would prefer to not to call me by my formal name, called me by my nickname when I was given a nickname when I was a kid. And he said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Oh, when I was about 10 or 12, my playmates called me the professor." They called me professor. Years later in Rome, the first time I took students to Rome, George, I've forgotten George's name. George, not Rodriguez. Oh dear, Giorgio. Doesn't matter. He's now teaching, I think, in Liverpool or Manchester. George and I and several other students had a celebratory drink in an English pub behind Santa Maria Maggiore to celebrate the end of the semester in Rome. And I asked them to tell me some of their most interesting experiences and the best and happiest experiences at RPI. And George looked up, he talked to some of them, he said, "We've agreed. It was the time you told David to call you professor." So these relationships, and that's why David Luchetti, whom I haven't seen for a long time, but I remember vividly, reminds me of those.
That's a great story. Patrick, this is from Michael Torsney.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
You know who Michael Torsney is? He's an eminent architect, retired in Canada. He went to high school with me when we were 16, and he left and went to Blackrock College and became a great swimmer. Became a world champion, actually. And he was coach to the Canadian national water polo team in the 1972 Olympic Games. And their dormitory, their residence, was across the courtyard from a residence where the Israeli swimmers and team were. And that was the night that the Palestinian guerrillas, they were not all Palestinians, mowed down half of the Israeli team with gunfire. And the Canadians were watching. And Michael said, it was very difficult to continue in the Olympics after that incredible sight of sheer massacre. Michael Torsney, anyway, I finally came, I missed him since I was 15 until I was 55.
Wow.
And I was swimming in a 200 meters freestyle in the US Masters Championship in Buffalo, New York. And I was wiped out in the 200 breaststroke. And I saw a name, Torsney, swimming the butterfly the next day. And he was competing against a world record holder from Cuba, Manuel Sanguili, great guy. And I said, this name is very familiar. It's Torsney. And he was walking down the deck after being pissed off by being second to Manuel Sanguili. And I said, Torsney, and he turned around. And I said, he said, yeah. I said, Sing Street. And he said, oh my God. We had both been students 15 years earlier at Sing Street. We have since swum together in world championships with Master. So what did Michael have to say?
Well, it's clear you have a fan club here tonight, and that's wonderful. In Ireland at school, you had to do Saturday classes in the trades.
That's right.
You think architecture students today should learn plumbing, electrical, carpentry, etc., although it subjects the architect's children to years of renovations?
That sounds like Michael. But he doesn't have a question for me.
Yeah, he does. Should they learn those trades?
Oh, no. Oh, no. They should learn the questions that will change those trades so the climate can be, that the planet can be saved. That's what. They shouldn't learn them as trade unions do them. They should learn the skills and the crafts and the techniques that make some of these craftsmen great. There is the story, I'm sure Michael has heard of this, but there's a story of a woman at a ball who had no, she found a society ball, she found somebody with a hat just like hers. And she went to her French hat maker. By the way, my mother was a milliner who designed hats. And she went to this wonderful hat maker, we'll call him Guillaume. And she said, Guillaume, there's a woman in the ball with a hat like the one you designed for me. I need a new hat. She said, calm down, madam. And he took a long length of beautiful silk and he pinned a piece of it to a portion of it to her hair and wrapped it round and coiled it up, put pins here, there, and there, and stuck a feather in it. He said, look, madam. She looked in the mirror and she said, my God, you're a genius. Ah, wonderful. What do I owe you? He said, $500 or francs, or whatever it was. And she said, but that's for 5 minutes work. It's just a length of $5 length of ribbon. And he immediately took it off and he said, the ribbon, madam, will cost you $5. It's what to do with the ribbon that's going to cost you the 500.
Right.
So they should learn how to put these together. For instance, every Saturday, we had to do a construction detail. Every Saturday for 5 years. Well, even in fifth year, we were doing working drawings, of course, for our thesis projects. But the very first thing we had to do was to design and draw a garden wall post, you know, square, 4 foot high post in brick. And we had to do it in Flemish bond, English bond, French garden wall bond, and English garden wall bond. Ever afterwards, as I pass the brick building, I can tell how good the brickwork is. And one of my dearest friends in this country is a bricklayer, a brick mason who lives in Clifton Park, who grew up among Dublin bricklayers who were at that time certainly heirs of the Georgian tradition of brilliant brickwork. And so we learned how to do that. And years later, with first year students, I asked them, one of the assignments was to live with a brick for a week. They said, where do we get a brick? I said, there are bricks everywhere, get a brick, live with it for a week. The Dean of Students wrote to me and said, he accused me of hazing the students because some of them complained, carrying a brick around for a week. And I wrote him a long letter explaining the educational value of this. At the end of the week, I would have the students throw their bricks into a pile in the bin in the front of the lecture. And I'd call one or two of them and say, pick up your bricks. They'd walk and unerringly they'd pick up their own brick. Why? All bricks are not equal, especially with wear and tear. So they realize a brick is not just, because the first time I asked them to draw, they drew a rectangular prism, you know, a geometric shape. A brick is not just a geometric shape. It has a frog in the bottom of it, so the craftsman can hold it better. And the frog contains most of the mortar so that the joints are thin. There are all sorts of things about a brick. And it was very interesting. Some of the students, one student met me in the gym one day at the pool, and I said, where's your brick? In the dressing room. And he said, oh, it can't swim. I said, yes, it can if you put it on the bottom and get your nose under it and push it like hell. Otherwise, just get out of the pool and find your brick.
That's great.
He lived with the brick for the rest of the week. They did all sorts of crazy things with it. But I think they got the point. The point was not to know a brick. It was to know, as Lou Kahn said, when he said, you say to brick, you raise a question. And brick answered, I want to be an arch. This kind of thing, which is manifest in his buildings at Indian Institute of Management, Dhaka, all those great buildings. Lou knew the spirit of brick, not just the technology of brick. And that's why it's important for the students not to learn trades, because unless they want to be builders. Because as I said at the very beginning, it's the purpose of building to stand up and keep the water out. It's the purpose of architecture to bring joy.
Thank you, Patrick. And it's clear by your entire lecture that that purpose includes a kind of magic that you brought into the.
No.
No?
The magic is revelation, discovery, realization afterwards. When you go back and you see something that you didn't realize you were doing that turns out to be great. A little view through the corner of a window, something like that.
So we'll take a little pivot here. This is from Harry. Has swimming giving you any epiphany about architecture?
Yeah. That is a funny question. Wonderful question, though. Yes, not an epiphany, really, but if you swim a long distance, say 3,000 or 5,000 meters in a pool, it's pretty deadly. If you swim it in a lake, around the lake or up and down or across the lake, back and forth, you get a totally different view of nature and the land under the water. And you're a part of a system that's much greater than yourself. If you're in a pool, you're an automaton going back and forth. And the hardest thing in the world is to do a 5,000 meters in a pool on pace. I have done that once. But it's much easier to swim 3,000 meters in the San Francisco Bay, despite the waves and the tides and all the rest that buffet you, because, well, yes, one epiphany. In the World Masters 3000 in San Francisco Bay, when we came out of, I was swimming with a South American woman and an Australian man who happened to be near me when we started in waves, and this is one of the older waves, and we came out of this canal, we were swimming into the bay proper, and we were hit by waves and winds suddenly, and I lost sight of them. The waves are only 2 or 3 feet high, but when you're swimming, that's high. I couldn't see the city, I couldn't see a ship, I couldn't see the Coast Guard, I couldn't see the rocks. All I could see was waves around me and the sun. And I said, you know, I could be in the middle of the Pacific. This is what it must be like to be lost in the Pacific and swim. I just better swim more relaxed. Hello, Michael, I see you back there. Anyway, that was a sort of epiphany, but other things that swimming brought me, I've swum in pools and places around the world, including a Raja's pool in Rajanpur in India. I've swum in pools in Italy, and every one is different. I've swum in rivers, I've dived from trees, and it all brings you closer to sort of being in the world, being alive in the world. In that sense, yes, epiphany. It makes for, I think it clears your brain, you know, because as you're as you're swimming along, thoughts come to you. It could be a song. I used to swim 1,000 meters to Beethoven's 7. That was the pace I set myself. There was always a musical rhythm to whatever pace, whether it was 200 breast or 1,500 freestyle. There was always a pace. And Beethoven's 7 was my pace for 1,000 meters. But one may have music, but then it shifts. The music is one's head. One sees something on the bottom, perhaps, that turns you to memory of a poem or an idea that you're working with, and you've turned your back on your design. You've turned your back on what you normally do. You've got to survive. But a thought comes clear, and you say, oh my God, why didn't I think of that before? The great man who wrote The Act of Creation, forgotten his name, great philosopher at MIT, Harvard. Can't remember his name. I used to read his work. But he once said, when you come up against a stone wall in your thinking, in your creative work, do something utterly different. Go dig a ditch with a shovel. Go fight somebody. Do anything that gets your mind off what you're doing. And when you've done all the shoveling and digging and planting and so on, turn back and you'll find your mind has found a ladder to get over the wall. Arthur Koestler, the great Arthur Koestler, he wrote Darkness at Noon, and he wrote The Act of Creation. Great, great guy. I can recommend the book to anybody.
That's a great answer, Patrick. Maybe this is the last comment and question, and I'm assuming it's from Sim Architects. Is that Eugene again?
Eugene, yeah.
All right. And it's beautifully written. And hi, Patrick. I've run across numerous former students of yours, from your UC-Berkely teaching days here in the Bay Area. They all tell me about your enormous influence on their careers and getting all energized about architecture through your Introduction to Architecture course, as I was also at RPI. Can you share with us your most memorable moments at RPI and your accomplishments that we should remember? I am so grateful to you for the impact you've had on my career, as well as all my classmates from RPI. We love you, Patrick.
Could you answer a question like that, Evan?
Could I answer a question like that?
Could you answer a question like that? That's a statement, not a question. But anyway, Eugene, yeah, there are some things. There were some very difficult moments in both institutions. We had student uprisings in both. The ones in Berkeley, well, in Berkeley we were in the 60s, of course, and it was the start of the free speech movement and the filthy speech movement and all that sort of thing. At one stage, we had to bail 400 students or 800 students, I've forgotten how many, out from Santa Rita prison because they'd been arrested by the police for occupying the chancellor's offices and the major offices of the university. That was probably one of the most memorable times of my life. I was a faculty observer of the student demonstrations and watching the blue meanies, as we call the Albany County Sheriff's men, come in with their batons, try to remove the crowd. The crowd got more dense. Oh, what happened was some 4 people drove a car into the plaza so that 2 people who were to be arrested by the police could get into the car and avoid arrest. Joan Baez was there, and she took her guitar and sat on top of the car playing songs that everybody knew, folk songs that everybody knew. And I thought, what a wonderful way to try and break the tension. I loved Joan Baez's voice. I still do, she still sings. But that was one of the most peaceful, peacemaking gestures I've ever seen. Another event at Berkeley, student event, memorable. Kirsten Russell, the dean's secretary, called me at home one late summer day and said, there is a student here who needs desperately to speak to a faculty member. I was still a young faculty. I was barely an assistant professor. And she said, could you possibly talk to him? I said, okay, send him down to my house. So he came to my house, a young Iranian student, accompanied by a beautiful young blonde woman. She had been admitted to the School of Architecture. He had been rejected. And he was distraught. He was clearly in love with this beautiful woman. And he needed to talk. We talked for probably 4 hours, at the end of which Morna Mosier was her name. His name was Nader Khalili. Morna Mosier had to leave to go to class or something. And Nader said, will you please drive me to the Greyhound station in San Francisco? I will go down to meet some of my friends in Los Angeles. He left. Morna went through School of Architecture and graduated. Some years later, I got a letter from Tehran, which announced the development of their first ever architectural magazine, edited by Nader Khalili and Morna Mosier. I got a copy of it. I still have it somewhere. Brilliant. Iran's first professional architecture magazine, edited mainly by this student who hadn't been able to get into Berkeley. He had somehow gone to architecture school, I think back in Iran. And I didn't hear much after that, except I knew Morna and Nader had split up because Nader's family wanted him to marry an Iranian girl. Nader disappeared from my life for a while until one day, one of our young faculty had been at the teachers' conference seminar in Cranbrook, Michigan. She said, I've got something for you, a gift from somebody. Now, I have to find this. Yes. It was a manuscript. It was a typed manuscript of a book called Racing Alone, One Architect's Vision of Building the Future with Earth, Water, Air, and the Magic of Fire by Nader Khalili, copyright 1982. This is the unedited manuscript of a book to be published in hardcover in spring 1983 by Harper and Row Publishers, San Francisco, etc., etc., etc. Inside, can you read this?
Yes.
Nader Khalili had spent a year going around Iran watching how old men handled cold and sun. They would use fire heated to something like 2,500 degrees, and they could know by instinct what it was, and bake tiles, bake clay, with which they would build a wall that could resist, maybe 10 feet high or 20 feet high, that would resist both water and frost and so on. And the sun on one side would be very hot, on the other side it would be cold. And they would make a pool where they could make ice. That was there were two of the elements that Nader studied as he went around Iran on his motorbike. The title, Racing Alone, is called after his son, who loved to run and was running around a field and very fast. And Nader asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm racing. He said, you're not racing anymore. Oh, said, I'm racing alone. And Nader called that his way too. Sometime later, Nader was asked by NASA to help them design potential dwellings on the moon. It was shortly after the moon landing. Now, the symbol of Archimedes, which Morna had known in Berkeley, was an image designed by a great architect on the faculty out there. It was the image of Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon in a spacesuit in the shape of Da Vinci's man. Nader was asked to design dwellings for the moon using moon material. He was also asked to design earthquake-resistant, waterproof shelters for the Navajos in the southwestern desert. He did both. I saw him finally at the 1984 Olympics. Well, I was at the Olympics with two of our sons in Los Angeles, and we found Nader and went to his house in Pomona, California, and found he was a faculty member in the university college there. And that was the last I saw him. He died of a heart attack recently. But Morna stayed on and left when the Shah fell and went to Hong Kong, where she established a small office. I saw her, Maureen and I saw her years later. She then had 6 offices in Beijing and other Asian cities, Hong Kong and several other Asian cities, doing mainly interior design work and architecture. She now has offices all over the world, including New York. Maureen and I were at her 50th anniversary of her office a year ago in New York City. And she's now a fellow of the AIA, but we found an interesting thing. She was not the boss. There's no boss of the practice. It's called Morna Mosier and Associates. Everybody in that firm, everybody is an equal. And we moved among them and we said, it works. Rather like Francis Oda's office in Hawaii, where small groups do each project, but everybody in that group is equal. There is no head. There's no place saying, this is what we do. No. We used to do that in our office. Everybody was equal. We had 8 people max. But that, there is a story of a disappointed student and a delighted student who have marked episodes in my life.
Hey, Patrick, you gave us a master class in architecture tonight. And I want to recognize you among your students, your colleagues, your family, the next generation of architects that are currently studying in the Green Building. You have a beautiful mind, a generous spirit, unbound curiosity, and a love for humanity. And you've taught all of us in the past and tonight. And you're an extraordinary mentor for these young architects that are going into the world and dealing with these profound existential challenges. And I just want to thank you. And you know, and I'm speaking from the moment I came to RPI, I knew there was an inheritance and that the reputation of the school and the institute was created by other leaders prior to my arrival. It's clear, not just tonight, but from everything I've ever heard about you and every encounter we've had and anything that I've seen that you've created in the form of text, in buildings and sketches, in storytelling and teaching, that you care deeply. You care deeply about the world that you live in and architecture as a benevolent project. And thank you.
Thank you, Evan. You flatter me. But I must tell you, the person who is going to be my bête noire for the next month is there in the middle of the screen. She is going to direct me in a one-man Christmas show in which I have to do something like 10 different parts. And we're looking for a place to rehearse and to do the filming. It will be a film, one of several films. If you have a space, or you know of a space in RPI that we might borrow, because we're doing a not-for-profit show that will charge admission in order to fund what they call the homemade theater in SPAC, in the Saratoga Performing Arts Center, which of course, like all theater companies, is suffering badly from the pandemic. And she's right there, Diane O'Neill, a great director, and she has dragooned me into doing this one-man show of several parts, and we hope that it'll work out. This is much easier than preparing for that. So please keep your ears open for a space that we might be able to find. We'll need it for 2 days of filming, and if you want to see the kind of quality that a film I've been in, you can look at a wonderful film by Logan Rando on YouTube. It's called The Fighter. It's only half an hour film, but it's a great little film. It'll get recognized one day. And that's, they'll give you an idea of the kind of quality we're looking for in this film. But we need a space where we can make the film. 2 days is all we need, and we need it free if possible. Okay. So, may I just say, before I go, thanks to some people on the screen there for turning up: Mike Torsney, Francis Pitt, Frank Grauman, and Neil McIndoe. How are you? And thank you for having me. Good night.
Thank you, Patrick. We loved it. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. You too.